Welcome to the What Lies Ahead podcast, where we explore everything related to the hardcore scene and community. I'm your host, Chris Ruffini, and my guest for today's episode is someone who's been a major player in the Long Island hardcore scene since the late 90s. Joining today is Chris Tzompanakis, the lead singer of the band Skycamefalling. With their unique blend of post-hardcore and metal, Skycamefalling helped shape the sound of the late 90s and early 2000s hardcore scene. From their energetic live shows to their emotionally charged music, Chris has been at the forefront of some of the most impactful moments in the scene. He also ran One Day Savior Recordings. Looking forward to discussing his history, the band's songwriting process, and what the future holds. Chris, thanks for being on. How's it going, buddy?
Good. Thanks for having me, Chris.
Of course, man. Appreciate you coming on. So I guess typically even though I've known you for a long, long time, I like to always start off with asking, when did you first realize music when you were younger? And then how did that build from heavy music into hardcore, going to shows from there?
Sure. So I started out mainly listening to like MTV, like mostly like glam rock and stuff, because that's what, was big when I was like very young, probably around like 10 or 12. And then Nirvana broke shortly thereafter. And I remember just being like amazed by, like by whatever it was that they were bringing to the table, which to me was something new. I hadn't heard anything like that before. After Nirvana, I actually, I told this story on a few times on a few podcasts, but there was a guy, my father used to own a deli. There was a guy that used to work there. And he actually, my dad had told him that I liked music. He actually brought in Nirvana Bleach on tape. He actually made me a dubbed cassette of it. And I didn't actually know that they had another record. Like I had no idea. And the fact that a band that was on a major label had a record before that wasn't on the major label, like I didn't quite understand that, situation or that scene at the time. So I started digging more into like Nirvana, trying to understand a little bit more. Nirvana was always very good about their interviews, like shouting out bands that they liked. It got me into bands like, Urge Overkill, The Breeders, the Pixies, Shonen Knife, like just a variety of bands, Dinosaur Jr., who remain one of my favorite bands today, like just a lot of bands that I hadn't, had never heard of. Over time, my friends and I, and this was kind of happening at the same time, I think, but a lot of my friends used to skateboard when they were younger. So we used to like rent a lot of those like skate videos. And I used to actually like listen for the soundtrack to kind of, and at the end, they would have the credits and I would write them down. And what we would do was, because we were located so close to the city and my father owned a place that was right around the corner from Mr. Cheapo's, the record store here on Long Island, I used to go and I used to take that, list with me. And whenever I'd go to the city, to Manhattan, I would actually go to record stores to try to find records from bands. So like, it was the first time I ever heard like Gorilla Biscuits, first time I heard Youth of Today, first time I heard Descendants, things like that. I would buy those records and take them home, listen to them. A good friend of mine from high school, her brother and sister used to hang out at the Angle, which was also in Mineola, which was really one of the first kind of clubs here that was having shows and having local bands. So I got to go with them a few times to see a few bands. So I saw like Yup Aside there, I saw Wheelchair there, I saw a couple of bands that like, at the time were kind of coming up, Mind Over Matter, etc. And then over time, we just kind of started to go to, more local shows. I had a few friends that drove. I wasn't driving at the time, so they would take me to some of the, venues that were a little further out, Huntington YMCA, Northport Pipeline, saw a few shows at the Roxy, etc. So really, that was kind of my first introduction to hardcore and what brought me, to shows. I'd say the thing that really pulled me in was a lot of the bands being up on stage talking about things that weren't just music related, right? Whether it was like politics or, straight edge or, vegetarianism, like things of just some different thinking that I really hadn't been exposed to before. And the sense of community, I think, was really what kind of kept me going back to shows. And I'd also say, right, like the mixed bills. I was generally not really a fan of like very heavy music when I was younger. So seeing lighter bands mixed with some of the heavier bands kind of was also, different for me and also, allowed me to kind of branch out in terms of like, what bands I liked, the styles of music that I liked, just kind of discovering new artists, new bands and looking up their influences as well. Cause, you'd get zines, you'd get other things, and you just try to dig in. And if bands were naming other bands, I was gonna write that down and just try to go find more of it.
Nice. Yeah. So it says like a natural progression for you, obviously, with the music.
Yeah,
So as that's going
100%.
on, you're obviously still, you're a teenager going with everything. How did Sky Came Falling come about, and where'd you meet the rest of the guys in terms of forming the band?
Yes, so I had a band in high school called Abstain. And it was like three of the kids I went to high school with. And we were, just a pretty generic hardcore band. We got in contact with a guy named Steve who used to run Hofstra Radio. So he actually used to play like our material on Hofstra Radio. I think I was probably like 16 or 17 at the time. He had told us that we should get in touch with a band called Suspect Seven. They were also from Long Island, and they were kind of making a name for themselves. So I got in contact with their guitarist John, and we booked a show together. I can't remember. I think it was at a place called Sanctuaries in Queens. I don't know if you remember that place,
Mm.
but we played there together, and we talked about playing other shows together. And it turned out that that was actually John, our guitar player from Sky King Falling, and Cameron's band, as well as Andrew, Cameron's brother. So we played together, and eventually my band broke up, but John and I stayed in touch with each other. I went away to college, and when Suspect Seven was kind of slowing down and starting to kind of go their separate ways, Andrew had formed another band called Fall Victim at the time. Um, they were, kind of on the verge of splitting. He had asked me if I wanted to start something as like a side project and sing for that band. That side project that we formed, which went by a different name at the time, eventually evolved into Sky King Falling. So when we had a practice with Matt, the bass player from No Submission, he was our first bassist. Our first drummer was a local friend of mine. But eventually, as the pieces kind of started, as people started to kind of fade out and practices went on, Suspect Seven had broken up. We brought Cameron into the fold. Cameron then, I think we had tried we wanted Ian from Standing Eight Count. I think he came down to a practice or two, but was committed to Standing Eight Count. So Cameron brought Matt in. And then after trying to find a drummer for a few months, we ended up, connecting with Parker, who was also a friend of John and Cameron's and everyone else. And that kind of just solidified the early lineup of the band.
Nice. Yeah. So what was that, around 96, maybe?
Yeah, I think it's like 96, 97. I think it's either late 96 or early 97. It sounds about right.
What made you want to be the singer? Did
So
that come
I
about?
can't play any instruments, but back when I was in one of my early high school bands, I we used to play a lot of Nirvana covers, and some of the heavier Nirvana covers, songs like Aneurysm and stuff like that, I would
Mhm.
always try to. There's a lot of singers that can kind of do that, like screaming in key sort of thing.
Yep.
I would always try to imitate that, but I couldn't do it. My voice would always just come out like a scream. So when I started getting to heavier and heavier music and hardcore, I realized that, like, wait, I can do that thing that they're doing. And so I just started to, get into bands that were screaming. And one of the first bands that I was in was Abstain, where I was screaming exclusively. Most of us we were just trying to rip off bands like VOD at the time, right? Like I think most of us were like, they
Yeah.
were kind of like the pinnacle of Long Island hardcore at the time.
Mhm.
And for metallic hardcore as well. So really, at the end, I was just trying to imitate what Tim was doing. And I realized that, since I didn't have any other, I knew I wanted to play music, but I didn't play anything. So I was like, well, you know what? Like if people let me front their band, then, that's just kind of how it went.
Okay. So you had your first band, broke up, and then obviously then
Mhm.
you guys come together. Sky Came Falling comes
Yep.
together. And I remember, at shows back in the 90s and just meeting and talking to you guys. But I remember Anthony Race always talking about you guys, like, yo, you got to hear these
Yeah.
guys, you got to hear these guys and stuff. And we played a lot together. And so you guys are formed, and you always guys had a mix of there's different sounds of how you mixed everything. There was metal. I felt a little post-hardcore. You had some melodic elements. Um, how did your sound develop then at that point over time? And what bands and genres do you feel were like played a big role in terms of shaping who you guys were?
So, you know, I think early on, I just actually came to learn this the other day, but the first song we ever wrote, which is the second song on the demo of Adornment and Disgust, was actually a Suspect Seven song that they had played out, which I had no idea. I thought that that was a song that they had written and they hadn't played it, or but I learned recently that it was basically a complete song at the time. A lot of I would say a lot of our like early influences were, a lot of the Victory stuff, like Earth Crisis, Snapcase. I think Cameron's always come at it from such a different angle, meaning like he's always been more into like very, I don't know, somewhat avant-garde, like just, like he likes a lot of like Bjork, he liked a lot of Bjork at the time, Nine Inch Nails at the time. Like he was not really coming from like a hardcore background. There were a few bands that he liked at the time, but I think he was kind of bringing a lot of different influences to the table. Parker was, very much into like into metal and hold on one moment, I'm sorry. Um, so Parker was very much into metal and, a lot of the, bands like Sepultura and, Metallica and that, type of material. Matt actually came from sort of like a very like jazz background and really was into like jazz music and whatnot. Um, I would also say that John was very much like into the like victory hardcore that I kind of described, and we had also really gotten into bands like the South Florida hardcore scene. So like Morning Again, Culture. Um, I'm trying to think like a few of those other bands like that Day of Suffering from North Carolina, like really some of those bands that were kind of bringing that like metal tinged element to it, but also kind of had a more modern twist. So I'd say that those were some of the earlier influences on us that we were kind of all bringing together and just kind of molding into what we thought was, at what I thought at the time was like, more like screamo to me, at the time of what that screamo genre was. But I also think it's interesting too, because a lot of times I talk to people and they're like, no, you guys are just like metal hardcore bands, like that. So like, I think that it was somewhat of a melting pot, but not too far away, from a lot of the influences that we had at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can as you're describing all of the different influences from the members of the bands, in certain ways you can hear that all incorporated into your material like that you guys have put out. So how do you crawl now you guys are together in terms of the writing process? How do you guys go about that? So was it someone would come in with the music? Would you have lyrics written and then sit, or or you're the kind of person that, all right, I need to hear the music first, then I get my
It
ideas?
was, yeah, so it was always where I was always writing at the time. I always like had a notebook with me, so I'd always write down stuff. I don't necessarily know if they were like lyrics, but I would often have, whole pages of things that I want, was writing about or a topic I was writing about. Um, Cameron mostly wrote whole like parts, like, and I wouldn't even say parts, like whole songs, and we would bring them to practice and we would practice them. And there would generally be a few times where we'd be like, you know what, maybe that transition doesn't work, or maybe we need to pull that out or add that part in. It was There wasn't a lot of that happening, but I would say that there were a few times where we try to like bend the music a little bit, like to fit some vocals. Mainly though, I would get whole songs and I'd have, lyrics written down, and then from those lyrics that I had written down, um, I would generally just like put my patterns to that. And so a lot of times, a lot of the lyrics I would just cut down based on how they fit into the songs that they were in.
Okay. All right. How long would it take to write songs? Would it take time? Some songs, you could go, they're done just like that. Some take time to work on. In terms of when you wrote songs for Sky Came Falling, how did you feel like that went? Do you think felt like they moved pretty quick? Typically, if someone, like you said, Cameron came in with the songs, or some, would there be tweaks, there be changes? That could,
I think they more or less came together pretty quickly, especially in the early days. There wasn't a whole lot of like, we would just kind of come up with the ideas, and it felt more or less like, we'd walk away and say like, okay, like that's complete, that one's done. Um, the I'd say more toward the end of the band as we were writing like 1021, I think a lot of those songs were a little bit more like, took a little longer, were a little more thought out. I think we had a little bit more there was more like people contributing, meaning like Matt was, had more contributions on that as well. He was less sort of like just kind of accenting what Cameron was doing, etc. So I think you had a lot of that happening. But for the most part, I think it was really just, things came together pretty quickly. The only thing for us was we pretty early on, we became somewhat of a full-time band, which I think to some degree took away a lot of time that we had from writing because we were on the road so often. So while, the band was around for as many years as we were around, we often weren't home. We weren't in an area where we were like able to write and just sit down and write, a record. We took that break for 1021, and then, after that, we wrote a few songs here and there. But for the most part, we were pretty committed to being on the road. So we really didn't get a lot of time to actually, put together a lot more material than what we had already recorded and released.
Yeah, because then you guys from there, your first LP, I remember it came out, and you toured everywhere.
Yeah, we had made a pretty big commitment early on. I mean, we did a lot of touring on the EP, but most of us were pretty young. Like Matt was only 15 or 16 when he was in the band. So, he was still in high school. The rest of us were in college, and, some of us had graduated or I had left college. But we had committed after we signed to Ferret and wrote 1021. We had said, all right, like we're just going to go out and do this, and we're going to see what happens, right? Is it sustainable? Can we keep going? We got lucky and we got a couple of really good tours at the time, so we stayed out as long as we possibly could. We also learned what it's like to live on the road and kind of be in that grind and that cycle that it's just um, you know I would say a difficult road to just kind of try to stay afloat. Considering like there were areas we do great, there were whole pockets of areas we would not do well. So, it was just kind of a grind to go through a lot of that. But, all in all, I think that we made that commitment to try to be on the road as much as possible. And we had the support from Ferret, and we figured out like as young as we were, like it was the chance to do it now. And if we didn't do it now, then we probably would have never done it.
Right. And no regrets with it, right? Because you went out a lot. I recall you guys were moving around
Yeah.
a lot. So
I mean, I do talk to, a lot of the younger bands that are kind of, like a great example of that would be a band that I'm like younger now, but like in Sydney area, when they first kind of came around and as they started to grow, you kind of learned like at the time, all of us were out there in vans, touring, you know, hitting the country, doing this grind, like I said, only to come to find out later that like, a band like them are going to do a weekend here and there, right? Like they're going to, instead of, trying to make it all the way through the Midwest, or from like, Chicago to Seattle. That's a good example because those were some of like the, insane drives that you would have. They were able to do like pockets and, fly out to an area, play, 3 or 4 shows and come home. And that's kind of like looking back on it, not necessarily regrets, but I think that wasn't a thing. Like you thought like, oh, you had to have a van, you had to get in that van and you just had to go. And if you would have slowed down and been like, wait, what makes sense? What are the right shows to play? What are not the right shows? But we were just so excited to be out there playing in front of anybody that would listen to us and being in a foreign place and having them, liking your music and buying your material. Like that was, I don't think there's anything that replaces that.
you guys had your own van, right?
Yeah, we had so our guitar player's dad, John, he owned a service station. So our very first van was one of those like little yellow school buses,
Yeah.
which as it turned out, we sold to On the Might of Princes, and then On the Might of Princes actually in their documentary too, that van caught on fire
Oh my
in
God.
Texas somewhere. I think they had changed the oil and they left the rag on the top of
Oh,
the engine block and it caught on fire and the van burned down. But
thankfully they're okay,
the
right? So yeah.
yeah, no, fortunately they got everything out. But we actually ended up after that getting like one of those little like metro buses where it had like the lift in the back and like the door. The only funny thing about that was the door that we had to that van actually never locked. So like through all the years and all the
Well,
times
your
of like
equipment, merch, all that stuff.
everything, and we would leave that stuff in the van, but like we had so many friends' vans that were like, their vans were getting stolen or getting broken
Yeah.
into, And we never had a problem, fortunately. Like, and that door never locked. It never had a lock on it. The other thing that we learned about that van also was the fact that those metro buses really aren't meant to do like long drives at the speeds that we were doing. So we had a lot of problems with that van. Like a
Oh
lot of the
man.
money that we had, I'm sure had we, had a van and a trailer, like a lot of other vans were, that had at the time, we probably it would have worked out better for us. But we thought like having this van was going to be this big thing, and like we had everything, like we had made lofts in it, we had put a TV in there with like a video game system, like we were all like, like we thought it was like the greatest thing. But like we blew a head gasket on it. We had so many problems with that van that like it was just a constant kind of like money pit for us, unfortunately.
Almost like as you're driving to the next show, you hope we get there, right? You
Oh
was
yeah, I
almost
mean
like you're
the
expecting
first
something
van
to
we
happen.
had no heat, we had no heat in the
Oh,
first van, and then the second van, was just a constant challenge. Like, with you mentioned Anthony Race, like he was out with us quite a bit. I remember him driving one time and like we blew out, we had dual tires in the back. We blew out an inner rear tire, and when it blew, it actually blew out our fuel line, so we
wow.
couldn't refill gas. So then like we were constantly delayed on tour or like missing shows and trying to make things up and like get to the next show because of
I
that.
was
Like,
actually I was gonna ask, did you ever
yeah, it
miss a
was a
show because
constant problem,
yeah.
constant problems. I mean, I can remember, a ton of shows that we missed where we had to like, like pick up the tour in another area because we couldn't get to where we needed to get to.
Mm.
And there were a few shows that we played where we ended up having to rent something, leave our van somewhere, rent something to get to the show, only to have to go back and pick up the van and then head back out again.
Yeah, it was just nonstop, right? Yeah, because as you were talking about that van, I definitely the first one, I believe, I with Parker, Race, Eddie White went, and there was someone else. We went to. I remember going in that van to see VOD, Earth Crisis, and Sepultura at Roseland. I actually remember that. So it
Yeah, it
had
was
to be one
probably
of your.
John. Yeah,
Yeah, it had to be the first
yeah,
one then. Yeah, it had to be
yep,
the first
yep.
one. So talk a little bit. So talk about your tours and stuff. But do you have though a favorite Sky Came Falling songs, let's say, not one, it's hard, songs, and a moment that stands out, that was very meaningful for you as a band?
Um, I think that from a song's perspective, I remember writing A Penny for Your Confessions and being like, we wrote that like in one take. Like that was a song where
Mm,
Cameron didn't like bring it to practice. Like he legitimately like we wrote that out of practice. And I actually remember you talked about like, did we write songs? Did we change parts? Like that was a song where I was like, hey, this part needs to be faster in the beginning, and we actually ended up speeding up that beginning and go back into that. And that song, I remember how that came together and just being like, it kind of had everything to me. Like it had all the melody that we wanted. It kind of had like the breakdown, some of like the heavy parts. Like it just really felt like that was like a defining song for us. Like in terms of like what our sound would eventually become. I feel like from the demo to the EP, like that was the song that we actually really kind of honed in on what our actual sound was and would eventually become. Um, there's other songs that I love. Like I love a lot of the songs that we don't play often because we don't play them as much, right? Like, so they don't get tiring or boring to me. Specifically, a lot of the tracks are on the later part of the album of 1021. Like, probably the last, were the second to last songs on that album, I think, are ones we often don't play. And they were kind of written a little hastily and recorded somewhat quickly as well because we didn't get a lot of chance to practice those. And they were often just songs we never played live. So those songs like The Truth Machine and Shallow Like Sand are kind of two of my favorites on that record. I would say, With Paper Wings, I think is really like a meaningful song for me. Simply, I know I wrote the lyrics for my grandmother that had passed, but also like I kind of just felt like even just the recording for as poor as it was, but the intro and the piano and everything kind of came together on that song. Again, I just
yeah.
really felt like kind of captured all of the emotion that we had in that song. In terms of like the moments that were like meaningful for us, I think that I can, and I still probably have it, like it's not necessarily in a show or anything that actually occurred, but like I remember when Good Life sent us money to record, and I went to the ATM machine. I still have that ATM receipt,
Hmm.
because I was so shocked that someone had wanted to invest their money in us as a band. Like these five kids from Long Island had no idea what we were doing, right? And someone from halfway across the world was sending us money to go to a studio. So that was actually really like a big thing for me. Signing with Ferret was a huge thing for us because Ferret was one of our favorite labels at the time, putting out some of our favorite bands. Like
Yeah,
they had
big
done
time label.
Harvest,
Yeah.
they had done Disembodied, they did Converge. Like those were all the bands we loved at the time. So kind of to be, with those bands and be peers with those bands, I think was a really big thing too. One of the other memories I think that actually is really was really interesting to do was Warped Tour as well. Like we got to play a good amount of Warped Tour dates one year toward the end of the band and kind of seeing the inner workings of a traveling festival, just to kind of like understand all the logistics that go into that and just, the various stages and like how everything gets set up and broken down at the end of the night and like how bands are fed, like all of those things were very eye-opening too, because it's like a world that you never really knew existed, right? Like
Mhm.
you go to these and you just think like, oh, like there's not a lot that go, this seems easy, right? Like just to kind of understand that like the inner workings of a festival and how much planning goes into that to actually make it work from stop to stop. That was like a really big thing too.
Yeah, now something like the Warp Tour, I'm just envisioning it back in the back. Is it just all chaotic, bands all hanging out, that kind of thing? Or it's or it's just,
There were a lot
your
of
set
bands that
time, you
were
get ready, and then your stuff comes off, and then
Yeah, there were a lot of bands that were just like, I remember like, hot water music, just sitting outside their van in lawn chairs, just like, like just hanging out, talking, like, you know, um, so there was a lot of that, like just bands like just chilling out and just kind of taking it easy. Like we would walk around and go watch some other bands. There were a lot of bands we liked at the time that were on Warped Tour, like or that we had never seen before, and like just even like being next to some people, like, like I remember like I think Reese and I were together when we like saw, one of the guys from Minor Threat, we're like,
Mhm.
yeah, it's the guy from Minor Threat, like just craziness, like what, like stuff like that, but like was really kind of cool to see and like see a lot of those bands that were playing for that year. And watching some of the younger bands kind of blow up and get really, really big. And seeing some of the bands that we had played with, like Thursday on Warped Tour, just kind of exploding at the time. But yeah, everybody was actually like it was everybody was really nice at the end of the night. Everybody had one of the bands actually, I think that we learned, one of the bands that's on the tour is responsible for cooking for all of the bands, like having like a barbecue every night for the other bands. So that year that we were on Warped Tour, it was a band that eventually got big. I think they were called Big D and the Kids Table. I don't know if you remember them, but they
Okay.
were the band responsible. So like you would just go, they'd make like veggie burgers and corn and all sorts of stuff, hot dogs, whatever, and you just hang out. The only thing that I think was really difficult about Warped Tour was the fact that we were one of the few bands that didn't have a driver. And we were doing some of the West Coast dates, and the West Coast dates had really long drives on it. So there was very mountainous drives, but like we would often drive through the night. And it was definitely you know, exhausting to do it, but just to kind of get to do it was something I don't think, like I never get the chance to do again, but at the same time, like was an experience that I don't think I'll ever forget.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so we talked about the next part. What I wanted to get into with you guys was your set list, and kind of two-pronged question. And it was is how do you guys determine what your set list will be? Obviously, it depends on if it's your own show or if it's a
Mhm.
festival. Or, but my actually question after that, you kind of answered it, was songs you wish you would play more, and you actually kind of
Yeah,
mentioned that. But how do you guys go about your set list? And I guess now, right? Because you guys did some
yeah.
shows with Poison the Well, you played Furnace Fest. You did the Long Island show. You did a little run with the Sleeping just recently. So how do you guys
Yeah.
determine? All right, what are we going to play?
So usually we're going to start off with, how long do we have, right? Do we have 30 minutes? Do we have 45 minutes? Whatever the venue is going to tell us, and that's what we're going to try to, back into. We usually will go and pick out songs that we know people want to hear or people tend to get the best responses. So usually that's kind of like picking, A Penny for Your Confessions or Of Adornment and Disgust. You know, what else? Shroud of Turin, Annulment off the EP. Visceral is another one that, so generally the songs off the EP are usually in there. We try to make a balance between the EP songs and the full length songs. The only thing that tends to happen is our full length songs are much longer. So those songs can be like 6 or 7 minutes. Some of them have intros, some of them have outros. So you kind of have to factor all that in. So usually we're going to try to do like 3 from the EP and 3 from the full length just to kind of get that balance. I think when we did the Poison the Well shows, we did one show where we leaned more 1021 and then another show where we leaned more EP.
So
So we're
those are
trying to
back to
have,
back, right?
yeah, those were
That's
back to
back
back.
to
So
back.
we were trying to
Yeah.
have that balance there as
Yeah.
well. When we did Furnace, we actually hadn't played Of Adornment and Disgust yet. So we actually decided, you know what, like let's play that one as something we hadn't played since we had been back. So we were really trying to work in some of the stuff that we didn't, that we hadn't played that we knew we didn't get it either. We didn't get a chance to play, but were songs that we wanted to play. It wasn't until recently, this last run that we did with Sleeping. I know, for the show that we were actually going to do on Long Island, we had plans to play a few songs we hadn't played in a really long time.
Mm.
Unfortunately, we didn't get a chance to play those. But that's really, I mean, I would say all in all, from, beginning to end, I think this band had maybe 20 songs, maybe less, maybe 18 if I really get down to it.
Mm.
So there's really not a lot to choose from. Because there's a few that we won't ever play, like some demo tracks we won't play. And then there's, like I said, there's a few, like, I don't think maybe once or twice have we ever played the instrumental off 1021. That's like a 10-minute song. So stuff like that are just, ones that we just won't play at all. So at the end, like, really once you get down to it, it's probably like only 12 or 13 songs we could really pick from. And then we just try to make whatever balance that is that either balances the EP and the full length and kind of works with the set time.
Nice. And what goes from there? So you reissued 1021. Was that, I guess, a year
Mhm.
ago, roughly? Give or take?
Yeah, it was
Little
about a
maybe?
year ago now. Yeah, we
Little year.
announced it
Okay.
in
So
January. Yep.
how did the idea of that come about? Obviously, it was an anniversary and all that stuff, but
Yeah.
was it something you guys were like planning as you were going with it, or
No.
just kind of got together and said, let's do this? And
Yeah, so what actually ended up happening with that was the original intent of that was we wanted to put the record out on vinyl. So we had a few stops and starts with that record. Like there was one time that we had actually re-recorded some of the music with Scott Gross from On to Ashes when he had a studio in Massapequa, not too far from us. When I think it was Hurricane Sandy hit and actually wiped out that entire recording.
uh,
So that was one of the plans that we had was to kind of re-record the entire thing and see where it went from there when the band was actually right around, that must have been maybe like 2008, 2009. Actually, no, because it was Hurricane Sandy. I think it was 2010. So right around that time that we had that momentum going. Then there was a few stops and starts where we had some interest from some other labels, a couple local Long Island labels, a few labels from Europe that were interested. And the idea at the time was like, hey, let's just take the CD and just press it on vinyl, right? Um, the only thing that we were worried about was Ferret actually had gotten acquired by Warner Brothers, and our record got wrapped up in this like Warner Brothers kind of like acquisition, and we couldn't figure out a way to get it back. So we were always writing to Warner and being like, hey, we don't have a contract. Can we, find a way to get this record? And as soon as they would find out that we didn't have a contract, all communications would cease. It would happen time and time again with different employees over there to just try to get that record back. What eventually happened was when we started playing with Andrew had the idea to kind of get the original tapes and see if there was anything on the original tapes that was salvageable where we could kind of remix it and make it work a little bit differently to figure out like could we do it ourselves. Once we got the original tapes, Andrew found a company, I think they were from California, where he bounced everything to digital. So now we have all of these files and we tried to assemble them. We realized like a couple of things. Number one, some of that material had degraded because it was on tape.
mm,
The second thing that we realized was some of it wasn't necessarily salvageable from a recording perspective, like bad mic placement, just poor recording in general, right? At the time, like we didn't know what we were doing. So we realized like this task was going to be pretty daunting. And there were times that we were like, all right, like maybe we should just give up on that. But the Sleeping had kind of kicked back up again. And they were recording their new record out in Woodstock with Chris Bittner at Applehead. So Cameron had the idea to, approach Chris and see if Chris would be interested in re-recording some of the guitars. So we ended up where Chris, worked with Cameron, they re-recorded the guitars, and then Chris actually did the mixing for it. And then once that was completed, we got in touch with Will Putney to master that record. But I don't think it kind of came together in like sort of like stops and starts. Like something would happen and it would, we'd pick up some steam and then it would slow down for like months at a time. And then like something else would happen and then it would like pick up. And in the end, like we started that during COVID, but I'd say in the end, it really came together in like the last 6 months. So we had originally intended to like have Andrew do the artwork. That's when John Contino got in touch, and he ended up like just putting the whole thing together, like
He's super
pretty much
talented.
what felt like overnight. He was just like, "Here, look, this is what I have," and we all loved it. Like all of those things at the end just kind of like came together really quickly, and it's kind of funny because we had gotten the Poison the Well offer like a few months, before that, and we like couldn't believe the timing. Like, I don't think we really intended to come back as a band. I think we just intended to put out this record, maybe play a show as a record release show, and then just kind of release it. But it just sort of spurred up some interest. The people got interested in it. The record did well for what it was, and we were, we're very happy with the way that it came out, and that kind of prompted us to continue, with the re-release of the EP and a few other things that we have, kind of working now.
Yeah, 1021 looks great. Contino did a
No,
great job.
thank you.
Like the artwork is incredible. It sounds great too. So you played Furnace Fest. You talked a little bit about it before. You did a little run with the Sleeping. You had the Long Island show that I
Mhm.
mentioned before. How was Furnace Fest actually?
So Furnace Fest was, I would say, like I've said this before. It was like one of the most well-run festivals I've like ever been a part of, and everybody involved in it was like super supportive and nice, and like there really wasn't like, it didn't really feel like there was any pressure. Like everybody was just really like kind and helpful, and I, can't say enough good things about all of that from the coordination perspective and the timing perspective and making sure things were running in the way that they were running. Like it was all handled so professionally. From a set perspective and from, the only thing that I would say, in my opinion, that was a negative, and obviously nobody has anything to do with this, it was just so hot. Like, I think it was like 90 degrees, when we were playing. Because we were playing in the middle of the day. We played at like 2 or 3 o'clock. It was like that, the height of the heat. To the point that like I almost passed out after we
Uh,
finished playing. That's how hot it was. But you know, we had played, we hadn't played down south in a very long time. It was nice to be able to play for people that hadn't seen us or hadn't seen us in years. So that was a good thing, and it was good because it draws people from like all over, like the country. There were people even flying in from like Europe and people that were there from Canada and other places. So that was like one of the best parts, was like getting to meet people, talking to people. We tried to stay behind the booth, for merch as much as we could because we love hearing from people. And it was actually nice to be able to get to talk to people and see people we hadn't seen in so long. Um, I'd say the other thing that was actually really interesting was the fact that we got a lot of like second generation listeners there too. Like we had people that were like, hey, my dad really likes you guys and told me that I should come and watch you guys play, stuff like that, which is like insane to hear.
yeah.
And then the other thing I think that was actually kind of funny was like kids would come up to us and they'd be like, hey, like I wasn't born when your record came out, and you're just realizing like how much of a gap, there is in age, now. So that was kind of interesting as well. It's just being able to play, but it was actually really cool to be able to play with a lot of like younger bands that were newer and coming out. Some of the bands that, had been around for a long period of time, and getting to see some of like the old favorites and some old friends that we got to see. So like, all in all, Furnace Fest, like you know, it was a long ways to travel to get down there, but it coordinated really well. We all made it work, and so it was a good time, and a lot of us got to like kind of make a little vacation out of it. Like I was able to see my family that's in Georgia. Cameron went to visit some people that were in Nashville. Even I think Andrew's kids went and checked out a college down there. So like we tried to coordinate some things around that to kind of just like make it for us as well.
Yeah, that sounds fun. That sounds fun. It's interesting what you said like a moment ago with it's when you're playing shows, it's interesting how you have teenagers all the way up to like 50 plus at the
Yeah.
shows, and it's you have people who are younger and they there's like twofold, like when we played, like my band played, there was the exact kind of aged just like from 18 to 50, dancing, singing along. And it was just crazy to me that they weren't even out when our album came out. And even when, I, did the song for you guys
Mhm.
that night, the pit was the same way for you guys and people singing along. It was the same thing,
Yeah, it's wild. I mean, the other thing you
Yeah.
see it too is you see it in the merch sizes as well, right? Like you remember going through like when we were printing merch back in the day, it was like you made smalls, extra smalls, youth larges, you know what I mean? Like stuff like that. And now it's like I have people asking me like, do you guys make, triple X, 4X? I'm like, no, like we've never made those. So we've had to like start making some of those different sizes for people. So it's been
Mhm.
like I just like how the time just shifts, and like what was in then is not in now,
Right.
so it's funny in that way.
It is. You guys had a lot of merch that night, the AMH show. A lot of,
Yeah, we had a lot of stuff that we printed a lot for Furnace. We actually ended up probably bringing too much to Furnace Fest. I think that was one
Parker,
of the big things. Like
Parker
we
mentioned that. Yeah.
yeah, we made a lot because we actually had some, again, it was like another one of these things where we had some plans for Furnace Fest and then things shifted and we were like, oh, we can't do that. So let's like, we kind of changed our priorities. So we ended up having like some leftover stuff that we've been fortunate, in the sense now to like kind of get rid of a lot of like that other stuff that's just been hanging around for a while. But really, I mean, at the end of the day too, it's like it's only been a year. So it's like,
Yeah.
like it hasn't been with us that long, but for me, when something's hanging out, like a shirt's hanging out for like 6 months, I'm like, we got to get rid of this, get it out of the
I
house,
feel the same. I know what
you
you mean.
know? Yeah.
But that stuff will go. And that'll actually lead to my next question because it sounds like you guys are all set up for potential future shows. So, would you call yourself semi active now? I guess in a way, right? Because I know Cameron's got the sleeping and,
Mhm.
so there's a lot of stuff going on. But would you call yourself semi active? And is there ever thought
Yeah.
of potentially new material?
Yeah, so I would say, yeah, we are semi-active. I think that, if the show makes sense, right? Like unfortunately, and I say this, like not with regret, but like ultimately, like we'd love to play every show we get offered. It's just unfortunately, Matt lives in North Carolina.
Yeah.
So we have to get him up here, and it tends to be where, once he gets up here, we have to, have a practice or two and then kind of like, so he's got to be up here for a few days. He runs a business down there, so he has to close that business and then kind of come up here. So we unfortunately, we've got some expenses that we have to cover when it comes to that. So like a lot of times we'll get offers like, hey, can you guys play this benefit show and stuff like that? And we want to, but it's just coordination wise, like there's nothing worse than, playing a benefit and being like, hey, but we have to make sure we make this money to get somebody back up here. So that makes it a little bit difficult. So we do try to be a little bit selective about the shows that we are playing. That's not to say that like if something popped up that like, like made sense that, we wouldn't do it. But, we tend to try to plan out a little further in the future just so, with everybody having jobs and families and, stuff like that, it makes it a little bit difficult at times. And then as I mentioned with Matt with travel, we have talked about new material. There's definitely been, like I said, some stops and starts with new material over the years as well. Like I think at one point we had something like 6 songs written, like not with vocals, but like musically, like years ago, probably around one of our first or second reunions, we actually had a bunch of material that we had written at a time. The one thing that I would say has held us back to some degree is the fact that when we were a band, we were all in the same room. You had nothing to do all day, right? So you just practiced for 6 hours, 8 hours. You just locked yourself in a room, and that was the weekend for you. Now it makes it a little bit difficult, right? It's like everybody's got priorities and other things that get in the way. So when we can practice, sometimes it's 1 or 2 hours at a clip, and it makes it kind of hard because it's like you don't kind of get that continuity
Mhm.
and between the practices, and sometimes it feels like, wait, what was that thing we were doing the last time? Like does anybody remember it? So you have a little bit of that, and then you also have like kind of like the newer stuff. I know you guys, I remember listening to a podcast, I think it was TNF as well, where you guys were talking about you're sending material
Yeah.
over the internet, and that feels almost like um, it's definitely foreign as well to me, right? Like it feels very
It was
um,
so different. But it was
yeah,
the Anthony was in Jersey, and to me, when you
right,
were telling me, North Carolina,
yeah,
and I'm thinking Anthony in Jersey, which is far, but it's not
right,
North Carolina, so it's hard.
yeah.
How do you, to do it
It
On
feels a little
Zoom?
cold, like you don't feel out the room,
Yeah,
and like sometimes we're like programming, you feel like you're programming drums and like not having something live and it doesn't have to capture the same energy. It feels very sterile is kind of the best way that I could say it. So we've had a lot of that and trying to get used to that. So it's not that I don't think that we wouldn't do new material. I think that that idea is always kicking around in the back of our head, but I also think that there's this other sort of like fear in the back of my mind as well, which is around the fact that like there's been a lot of bands that have come back and put out new records after they've broken up. Some of them have been fantastic, right? Like, I look at a band like Hopeful, they put their record when they came back and it was like, holy cow, like this, it's like they haven't missed a beat. It's like a more modern Hopeful, and then I look at some of the other bands that have come back, like, one of my favorite bands over the years was like, let's say At the Drive-In, and like, bands like that are coming back and I'm just like, ooh, or like, Refused on some of their last ones, like it's just kind of, it doesn't feel the same. And granted, I understand, right? For those musicians, everybody wants to be moving forward. Everybody wants to be, you don't want to do the same thing. You don't want to be stale. You don't want to keep playing the same music. But for the genre that I think, for the bands that we play in, that's what kids also want to hear. Like they don't want to hear you, you try and like, hey, we're gonna do this new death metal song. You know what I mean? Nobody wants to listen to that. Like they want to hear the band that you are. So I think that that's something to always take into account that makes it somewhat like makes me a little bit hesitant at times, right? Because I just want to make sure that like we're staying true to what we did, and at the same time, like it is a little bit more of a modern version to some degree. So I think that there's like, there's been a little bit of back and forth in terms of like our conversations with that, and and like, what does that hold, right? Is there going to be new material? Is there something that we're going to do? So we continue to discuss that and kind of like, feel it out to see like if something that we do right, is something that we feel like we want to put out and actually, sort of like test the waters and see how it does.
Yeah, and for what I'm hearing here, and even just remember from conversations with you guys, it's not as if there is someone who will come in and write something, but you need everyone in there to write the songs. It's like a collective, organic kind of thing that occurs.
Yeah,
So right,
exactly. Like,
it's
and
not like
that's been,
you don't have
yeah,
one person with you. We'll write the song. They'll come in and
yeah.
you need everybody in there.
Right. So that's like, been one of those things that's been a little bit difficult and, like getting schedules to coordinate, making sure everybody could be there together and kind of like, working together. Like I'd say that it's in the last few months, it's come together a little bit better. But like, for like 3 or 4 months there, we were constantly trying to get together and everything would just get in the way. Somebody's kid was sick or somebody,
Right.
had, got called into
Life.
work or like all of those things, just life just kept getting in the way. So like I'd say now, that we've got a little bit of a break and we don't really have, anything upcoming at the moment. We've been able to sit down and kind of like coordinate practices and also like, not just new material, but like really just be able to, be able to like focus on some of the songs we never play, right? So a lot of times, like when we get together to practice, we play like those two songs that I mentioned. Like,
Cool.
we play those often. Those are the songs we're playing together to kind of like get warmed up.
Yeah, that's exciting. And I know people definitely would want to hear some new stuff from you guys. One day it'll become soon enough. Just quickly, we were talking. I mentioned in the beginning. You want to talk about One Day Savior recordings a little bit?
Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah, yeah. So just how that came about and
Yep. Yeah.
why
So
why
like
you did it. Yeah.
I think so funny story, but when I first applied to college, there was actually a way that you could get some financial aid at the time. And one of the ways you can get financial aid at the time through the school was showing that you were an entrepreneur. And some people that went to my school, I went to school for culinary. So some people that actually went to college, like had run like a small cafe or like had like, some catering business that they were doing on the side, like stuff like that. So my idea was, you know what, like I'm really into music. Like, why don't I put out a record? So what I actually thought of at the time was my band Abstain. I was going to put out a split with another band from Long Island called Short Form, who were from Levittown, I believe. So I
Yeah. Okay.
had, yeah, I had their DAT tape, and I had our DAT tape, and I was ready to do everything. And then the bands both broke up, so I was like, you know what, I'm not going to do this. But I researched it so much that I was like, you know what, like I want to put out a record. So when I went away to college, I used to always sneak into the library and go online on Victory Records website. They had like a Victory chat, like a chat room at the time. And I used to talk to a bunch of people, and I met this band from Canada called Ignorance Never Settles. And they were members of a band that I was really into at the time called New Day Rising from Canada. And they were like one of my favorite bands. They were like one of the first bands I remember that was like screaming and singing. They kind of combined those two genres at the time. So they had a label that was supposed to put out a record for them with it was a split with a band from Missouri called Incision. And I was like, I had all the stuff that I was like, had, all the quotes and everything that I had when I was going to do this. It was just now like 6 months later. So what I decided to do was I was like, you know what? I'm going to call up all these people, and I, got their DAT tapes, got the artwork done, whatever. And I just decided one day, I was like, I'm going to press, 500 records and see what happens. And I traded them all away. And I eventually had like a little distro that I was like, oh, I got to sell records at shows. So that was cool. And being able to do that. And then I was going to college in Providence, Rhode Island at the time, and I met a band called Day After, who were kind of like really metally. And there was another band there called Corinne that I really liked. They had a record on Hydra Head. Corinne eventually was Jesse Leach's band, who's now in Killswitch Engage. But Day After kind of sounded a lot like them, and I was like, yo, I really like this band. And I approached them. I was like, let's do a 7-inch. Put out another 500 records, traded them all away. So like the ball just kind of kept rolling. And really, it just became a means for me to kind of see bands that we played with at shows, and I was like, "Yo, that band's really good. I want to put out their record," or that I had like met through the internet or whatever the case may be, and actually just really liked them. My taste is somewhat eclectic, so like it was like all over the place. Like I was putting out bands that were like more indie. I was putting out bands that were I think like one of the bands I had on the label was like more kind of in the new wave kind of Duran Duran sound. I had other bands that were like heavy hardcore bands or, metal bands, whatever. Like it was just all different. What I really was doing at the time was I was just putting out one record. If it did well, that kind of gave me enough to, momentum to kind of get the next thing going. And because I was doing a lot of trading, it wasn't where I had to sell my record. So for a lot of unknown bands, I was getting to sell records for other bands. Like I remember trading a bunch of records and getting back like the first Walls of Jericho 7-inch, you know what I mean? And like I got to sell that because there was some hype behind a band like that. And that's just what kind of kept the label going. So I just kept going like release to release to release. And then eventually I teamed up with Lumberjack Distribution at the time. And, they were getting our records out. And then things kind of exploded from there, like meaning like not the label, but like music in general, right? That's when we started to see like hardcore kind of take a turn and become a little bit more mainstream at the time. So you were seeing bands like, victory bands that were like, you know, becoming huge, right? You were seeing bands like Thursday, Hawthorne Heights, like all of that. Like all of our bands were like getting shirts, like not all of our bands, but like bands of like our genre were getting like shirts in Hot Topic, records in Hot Topic. Like this was something that was new to us. Like you would go to see like an end cap at Best Buy with like a bunch of CDs of bands you knew, so like that kind of I would say like that momentum kicked the label into like the next gear where we ended up putting out a couple of records. And I say we, like I put a couple of records out that were EPs, and then those bands got picked up by bigger labels. So really I just sort of saw it as more like a farm system in a lot of ways. Like I enjoyed finding a band, putting out a record, having them go on to something bigger. A lot of times I wasn't getting like contracts from these bands. It was just kind of like one-offs. So, you saw bands like Remembering Never went to Ferret, Boys Night Out went to Ferret, Paulson went to Doghouse, Celebrity went to TVT and then eventually Doghouse. Like Juliana Theory did their thing, Movie Like did their thing. So like all of these records that I got to just put out one record for, these bands went on to do bigger and better things. So it was actually really nice and a really good feeling to be able to do that. And then I would say toward the end of it, so I was really still into vinyl and I was still getting to release some records on vinyl, like even at the time that no one was buying vinyl, like I put out 1,000 Hopes Fall records and it took years to sell them. That nowadays, like probably like kids are paying crazy money for on Discogs, like stuff like that. I, pressed a couple of like records for like I pressed a record for the band Embodiment. I did a couple of split 7-inches of like bands that I liked, and like like that band Knives and Greenwater that Andrew was in, with a band that did a record on Ferret, Suicide Note. I had a few of those, but then over time, like kind of like once digital hit, and you were seeing like Napster and file sharing and all that stuff. Like the industry came crashing down. And what ended up happening was a lot of records that you thought were sold, you would sell to stores, started to return at these numbers that were like, like it would almost felt like you didn't even consider them sold, like meaning like you considered them gone. And like lo and behold, you were getting back 200, 300, 400 records at a time, or CDs at that point. So it just kind of, the industry just sort of turned on itself. And I felt like, you know what, like this might be the right time to kind of pack it up.
Mhm.
So, I ended up connecting with a guy from Philadelphia years after the label was somewhat inactive. And he's like, hey, I heard you might be interested in selling your label. So I sold him the label with all the back catalog and everything else that was left over. I was like, here you go.
Hmm.
And that I think lasted like another year or so. He put out a few other records under that name and eventually it just folded all together.
Well, it sounds like an amazing experience. Like you just took it, started it with, hey, I'll put out my band as a split 7 inch that led to friends bands that blew up into this whole thing. It snowballed, like you said,
Yeah. I
positively.
mean, yeah, it was definitely, you kind of learn those inner workings. I had some great dealings with people. I had some terrible dealings with some people.
Yeah.
Some of the bands that got really big, like ended up with some managers that like wanted nothing to do with my record being out there. So there were a few records I actually had like taken away from the label where people
Oh,
were like, yo, you can't put that record out. Like, no longer are you going to be able to press that record. I'm like, I have a handshake deal. So it was kind of upsetting sometimes to see some of the bands, and I get it, right? The band, like my own band, did the same thing. Like you have people telling you what you think is the right move or the right next move. So you listen to them because you think they know better than you. And then in
mhm.
the end, what ends up happening, you know what I mean? Like it ends up where a bunch of people just get pissed off and things don't get worked out. Like a lot of these bands over the years, like, had so many bad dealings with labels and managers and whatnot. But I really just did it because I loved those bands. I just loved the music and I wanted to put something out from them. It didn't
Yeah.
matter if it did, 1,000 or 5,000 or, 500. I think the only thing that was somewhat disappointing was there were definitely a few records I put out for bands that like, by the time either the record came out or shortly after it came out, they broke up,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, so it makes it difficult
Yeah,
to
it's
move it,
like,
right?
there
Yeah.
were some bands that were like touring machines and then literally the record comes out like, hey, we've been touring for too long, we're tired, we're done. Like it's like, oh, I got 1,000 of these records I'm gonna sit
Yeah.
on for a while. So
Mhm.
that happened a few times too, which
Yeah.
was, tough, but yeah.
And this was, you said college it started, so just think of it's like it's almost like on the job like internship training that just gives you a business sense and probably things that you took from then that you absolutely probably utilize now with what with
Oh, 100%. I
right?
mean, like I tell everyone, funny enough that like I don't know about you, but like I was always like the band dad. Like I was always the one that's like, hey, we gotta be at the show at this time. We gotta make sure that we're here. Do you have this? Like, let's count merch. Like I was always the person doing all the coordination. So like I tell everybody now, like most band dads could probably be project managers for like, like consulting companies or whatever. It's
Absolutely.
literally it's the same thing. It's just like coordinating with clients of like, when is this due? When does that need to be done? Did you get that done? Like
Mhm.
literally looking after a team. So much of what I do now really is are skills that I learned like back then. I mean, even just how to use Excel. You know what I mean? Learning how to use like understanding finance, like learning how to use QuickBooks when I was a kid. Like this stuff helps me with my taxes now. You know what I mean? Like there's literally things that I learned from being in a band that were like on the job skills that never anticipated in a million years I'd be like using today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I guess one last question here, then we'll end off with a little rapid fire thing, which I'll eventually
Sure.
come up with a better name than that, but that's what it's
Yeah,
called for
no
now.
worries.
But what advice would you give yourself at 17 years old?
I think there's probably a couple of things. I'd probably say two. The first one I would say is like, don't take this shit so seriously. Like I tell a lot of folks, like I had a vision for what I thought this band would be. And nothing was gonna stop me from like fulfilling what that vision was. And I would say that like when members left the band or, even during arguments or whatever the case may be, like I just was so rigid in my approach, like just so rigid in the sense of like, this is what I see. And I was just constantly chasing that dream all the time. Meanwhile, like in a lot of ways, I do feel like, because of what I was chasing, it kind of led me to kind of look down on other people or put other people down in the sense of like, like a lot of our peers, like, what brought me into music was the sense of community. And I feel like as the band started to grow, it kind of pulled me away from that sense of community because I was so focused on the business end of things and trying to just like I wanted nothing more than for this band to like work. You know what I mean? Like, and when I say work, like work out to the point that like I didn't have to work a regular job, to the point that I didn't have to go home anymore, to the point that I could just stay on the road and play music for the rest of my life. And there were times that you got a little bit of a taste of that. And when I got that taste, I just kept chasing it all the time. And so I'd really sit back and say, like, you know what, like looking back on it now, I wouldn't have taken everything so seriously. Just like, I don't think I got to enjoy a lot of the times that we were having on the road because I was just so stressed out about trying to like make it all work. So
Hmm.
like that was probably one of the first things I would say is like, you know what, like to just have fun with it, to just, like appreciate it for what it is, that I can look back on it now and just say like, hey, I'd say the second thing that I probably, give myself some advice to also is like, you know, like just kind of similar to what I said before, but like just take this as it comes. Like I feel like we were so stressed out about like either trying to write new material or trying to like, you know, meet deadlines and whatever the case may be of like all the things that went into it that like I really do feel like we as a band sometimes we just like we missed a lot of like the it took a lot of the fun out of it. Like it really did. Like the business end of things and like the like trying to be kind of caught up in that overall label like, machine and like music, like industry, I think really sucked a lot of the fun out of it in the end. When, like I said, like I just think we all just could have been if we were just appreciated what we had at the time and been like, you know what, like if this works, it works. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. There was sometimes where it felt like it could be a little forced, especially in the end when we, as we started to kind of like, as we started to kind of dissipate and the band started to break up, it very much felt that way.
Yeah, it's like absolutely it's like be in the moment almost,
Oh, 100%.
and you're
I
going
mean,
100
looking
miles
back
per hour at
now,
that age, you're not
yeah,
even thinking of that stuff. So
yeah. I
it's like,
mean,
what's
looking
next?
back
What's
now,
next?
yeah, I mean, I could sit here and talk to you about Furnace Fest and how much of a great time I had because I was actually able to sit down and enjoy
Right,
myself, and get to meet with people and talk to people and all of those things. Whereas, like, back then, it felt like you were running from one thing to the next.
right. And even what you were describing when we were talking about newer material now, you're like, basically, it's like, it'll happen. It'll happen. Obviously, you're not saying that 20, 30 years ago. It's just you
No,
have to,
yeah,
right? You have to move, right?
yeah,
And
you got to keep going.
yeah, and I agree wholeheartedly with what you said there. But so I guess yeah, we'll end here with the rapid fire stuff. So first that comes to mind. So festival or a smaller show?
Smaller show.
Smaller show. Top three favorite all time albums. Doesn't have to be hardcore.
Dinosaur Jr., Where You Been? Um, Mew, Frangers, Radiohead, OK Computer.
Yep. Favorite band that you've played with?
Musically or personally?
I guess we'll do both musically, and then
Musically.
yeah.
Morning Again. I mean, I'm talking like back in the day, like playing with Morning Again and Harvest were the two bands that I was thrilled to play with because I was the biggest fan of those bands.
Okay. Well, I guess personally too.
Personally, Thursday were wonderful people, awesome to be out with. Also, a band that we were huge into at the time. They were just a band that we had such a long tour with that you really got to know them. Whereas a lot of times, like we play like a weekend with them, you really didn't get to like meet many of the bands that you were, like that you were playing with for 2 days.
A band you wish you played with.
Mm. Hmm. And I wish I played. I would say Day of Suffering was probably a band. They were broken up by the time that we got together as a band. They were a huge influence of mine, and I would honestly say that like if I could have played with them, I would have in a heartbeat.
Well, you may have answered this 2 questions ago, but I'll answer anyway. Favorite Sky Came Falling tour?
So I think the Thursday one was, like I said, that was a really great tour. I actually would probably say From All of the Ashes was one of my favorite tours that we ever did. Mostly because I think when From All of the Ashes was coming up at the time, they weren't as big as they eventually became. And like we were kind of like in that little middle like era there as well. And we knew them personally, and they were great people, and we were constantly pranking each other, which was got to be a bit of a problem toward the end. But like, yeah, that was so much fun to be out with those guys.
Cool. All right. Older Long Island venues here. Deja One or Ground Zero?
Deja one.
Yeah.
By the way, can I just tell you, I lived 2 blocks away from that place, and I would go home. There was a band that I didn't like. I'd just be like, I'm going home, and I would like watch TV and then come back.
That's great. So yeah, 100% has to be Deja One.
Yeah, it was Deja.
Most underrated Long Island hardcore band from the late 90s.
Underrated Long Island band. I don't know. I think they're underrated to the rest of the world. My favorite, absolute favorite Long Island band is Motive.
Mhm.
I believe that 7-inch, even their CD, I was listening to it on YouTube the other day. Just a band that does not get enough credit for what they brought to the table here, as well as, from like the greater scene in general.
Yeah, they had a really good. I like their sound. They were really good.
They were
And then
they were probably the one huge Long Island influence for us. Like they were a band like not many others. They brought that like metallic kind of edge to
Yeah.
it, but still like had that Long Island sound in a way. They were probably in my opinion, the one of the best records that's ever come off Long Island.
Pete Motive's a good dude. So yeah, they were good. They were a good band. Newer bands you like?
Long Island or not?
Any?
So Long Island, I think Koyo is fantastic. I really like Heavy Hex. I think Private Mind is actually
Yeah, they're really good.
really awesome for a young band. And like they've got some super catchy songs that I actually really enjoy. Um, I'm trying to think who else that I like. Dying Wish. I think they're obviously on the up and up now. They're gotten to be a pretty big band. Um, yeah, I'd probably say those. Probably
Okay.
mine.
1021 or To a Forever Embrace the Sun?
Ooh. I'm gonna say 1021.
Mhm. Yeah, they're both good. That's a good one too. What band? What did you listen to last? What band? The last music you
Uh,
listened
the last music I listened to, let me bring up Spotify right now.
to. Mhm. Mhm.
Actually, it's What Lies Ahead podcast with Mark from Shutdown. This is the last thing that I did listen to, believe it or not.
Thank you.
But hold on. Actually, it was Envy,
Okay.
the Japanese band.
All right. Last question here. A band or artist that you like that would surprise people?
Hmm. Um, oh, here you go. One of my favorite records from college, and still to this day, I can listen to it and actually enjoy it quite a bit, is remember that band Frente?
Yeah.
That record, I think, is a fantastic, poppy, really awesome, like kind of like bubblegum pop for what it is for that time era. They did the cover of Joy Division, which got them pretty popular.
Cool. Chris, thanks, man. Appreciate you coming
Yeah,
on
of
here.
course.
Let me just, we'll wrap up here in a moment. Let me just end off and
Yep.
hang tight. Thank you for listening to the What Lies Ahead podcast, which is available on all streaming platforms. Please save the What Lies Ahead podcast playlist on Spotify that features all bands featured on the show. For more information on future episodes, you can go to my Instagram account and follow us at What Lies Ahead _podcast and on Facebook by searching What Lies Ahead podcast. See you on the next episode.